friends, it's Christy here with day 2 of my 2020 holiday card series. Today I'm going to be making a card using Sunny Studios Penguin Pals and Winter Scenes. So I've stamped out the images I'll be using on some Nina Solar White cardstock with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink. And I'm going to start coloring with my Copic markers using the C3, C5, and C7 for the dark parts of my penguin. So rather than using black, I'm going to use some really dark grays, and they're going to read as black on the final card. I just think the grays have a little bit more depth and personality to them. So I use that C7 to lay in some shadows on my penguin's wings and around his head, under his hat, and on the sides of his body. And then I'm blending that out with the C5. I also added a little shadow in the crease right over his beak. I'm going to fill in his sides with that C5, but I saved some room on his wings and his forehead for that C3 so I can have a nice highlight there. So I'm just filling in all the rest of that white space. For the white parts of his body, I'm using C0 and C1 and just adding a little light shading on the right hand side there, up under his scarf and under his wing with that C1, and then blended that out with the C0 and let that fade into the white. And I thought I was recording when I colored in his beak and feet and the fish, but I must have missed the first layer, so I'm going to do the second layer on screen for you, and that is with YR02, YR04, and YR07. Just use the YR02 on the fish, just the darkest two shades on his beak and feet. And then for his hat and scarf, I wanted to have purple. So I'm using V05, V06, and V09. So that shadow shade is the V09. And I did a little bit on the right and left of his scarf, but more on the right since he's turned a little bit toward the left. And then the same with the hat. Most of that shadow is on the right hand side, and then a little bit under or at the top of the hat brim. And then I blended that out with the V06, and then I'm going to fill in the rest of that white space with the V05, just making sure to catch the edge of that V06 first and pull that toward the center so that I get a nice smooth blend. And as always, I always do 2 layers of all of my coloring, but I just show the one on screen to save you time in the video. For the white parts of his hat, I'm using BG10 and BG11. I'm also going to use those shades for the snow on top of the pine tree and also the snow on the igloo. So I used that BG11 first, and then I went back with that BG10 and just blended a little bit. I just left the one shade on the hat. And then I'm just going to do like a little L shape on each of the bricks of the igloo to give them a little bit of a frosty glow. And then I'm moving on to my pine tree, and I'm using G24 and G28 for that. So the G28 I'm going to put right up under the snow since that would be casting a shadow. Just really thin little lines since that's such a small little area. And then I'll blend that out with the G24 towards the tips, just doing kind of like a little circular motion to break up the edge of that G28 so I get a nice blend. And then for the trunk, I'm just going to use E27 and color that in solid, and then I trim those out with the matching dies. For my background, I cut 2 of the inner panels from the slimline scalloped frames, and one of those I trimmed down with the slimline nature borders, and the other one I left whole. So for the complete one, I'm going to begin to sponge on some Distress ink so I can create a purple sky, and I'm using shaded lilac for the bottom portion and just blending that on nice and thick. And then I'm going to transition into seedless preserves, And this one has much more of a reddish tone, so when I first go on, I'm using very light pressure so that I can get a nice blend, and then I'll just gradually build up that color. With Distress inks, whether it be the oxides or the originals, it's all about the layers. That's what's going to help you achieve those beautiful blends. So I'm going to work back and forth on that transition area and make sure that it is nice and smooth. And then I'm going to move on to my darkest shade, which is Dusty Concord. And I'm going to come in from the top with that. And again, that's much more cool tones, so I'm using a little bit of a lighter hand at first, and then being a little heavier at the top where, it's not being blended into another color. And again, I'm going to go back to my seedless preserves and just blend back and forth over that transition area until everything looks as I like it, In the end, it's all personal preference. So I'm going to squirt some water onto a small acrylic block and use a paintbrush to flick that over the surface. I was trying to avoid getting some of those larger drops, and it didn't really work, but I found that on this particular card I didn't really mind them. I also just gave it a squirt straight onto the card, and now I'm adding some Copic opaque white onto that block and watering it down a bit, and I'm going to flick that over the panel as well so that I can have some snowfall. I will set this panel aside to dry and move on to my die cut panels, and for those I'm going to use some tumbled glass just to add a little bit of a frosty haze at the top of each of those sections so that it will match that frosty glow on the igloo. So I just blended a little bit on each section, and I was a little bit more heavy-handed on the bottom one, and then I kind of got lighter as I went up on the panel. To create my slimline card, I took my 8.5 by 11 cardstock and cut that down to 8.5 by 7. And now I'm going to score it in half at the 3.5 inch mark with my Teflon bone folder. And then I'll give that a good crease. And then I'm going to pop this card base in my MISTI. And the cardstock, by the way, is MFT's Grapesicle, and I'm stamping on the inside in Lawn Fawn's Juice Box ink. And I'm doing another penguin and a sentiment from the Sunny Studio Inside Greetings Holiday that says, "Wishing you a season of joy, a season of cheer, but most of all, a wonderful year." For my outside sentiment, I have die cut the scripty words from the layered snowflake frame by Sunny Studio out of some Lawn Fawn chili pepper cardstock, and I'm going to just set that aside until a little bit later on. I've also die cut the scalloped frame from the Slimline scallop frame die set with some plain white cardstock. I actually used a piece of Bristol so that it would match those snowbanks. And I adhered that flat to the card front, and now I am layering on my background panel, just smoothing that into place, and then I can start to adhere my snowbanks. I'm going to begin with the one on the bottom. Now if you set these right on top of each other, you would just get a double stitched detail edge, but I wanted mine to have a little bit more of a layered look, so I'm just tucking in that stitch detail into the one below it on each of those panels, and that just gives me a little bit more dimension, even though the card is going to stay nice and flat for mailing. Before I add that sentiment, I want to adhere my igloo so that I know how much room I have above that. So I'm going to add that on the topmost snowbank. And then while I'm adhering my images, I'll also go ahead and add my penguin down at the bottom. And he's going to be holding that little fish, so he can be bringing a gift to a friend. And then I've got the pine tree, and I was just trying to figure out where I wanted that to go on the card. But I decided that I liked it best up on top with the igloo, just because of the scale of it. since it's smaller than the penguin, it looks better if it's further away in the distance. So now I can pop out the little pieces of this sentiment, and I'm going to use my craft pick to just remove any of the little chads from the insides of the letters that I don't want. And then I'll add some liquid glue to the back of each of those letters, and I'm just squeezing out the tiniest amount and then tapping on the back of that with my finger so I don't have too much excess on there. And I'm going to add the word winter first, so I'm just kind of setting that in place without pressing it down too hard until I've got that W aligned with it, so I make sure that it's placed perfectly, so because I don't want to have like too much excess glue on the background if I would need to pull that back up. So then I am going to add the rest of that word. The E and R are also separate, so I'm just going to line those up with the top little swoop of the T there, or I should say the bottom swoop of the T. And then there is the word wishes, and that one is all together except for the W. So again, I'm just poking out the little inner pieces of those letters. I had one more there in the S that I missed. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to kind of line up everything and make sure that I have it placed where I want it before I begin to add my liquid glue to the backs of those. So just like with the other one, I'm just kind of tapping that glue on the back. I don't want too much of it. It was still kind of coming out a little too thickly for this delicate die cut, so that's why I just tapped on the back with my finger and tried to remove any excess. And then I'm going to align that right beneath the word winter, and then I can do the same with that W. And you're going to want to keep a baby wipe handy if you're doing that kind of thing, wiping off the glue with your fingers, because your fingers get really sticky. So then I'm going to just make it easy on myself by adding a little dot of glue above the eyes, and then I'll pop out the little dots and use my craft pick to help adhere them, or at least that was the plan. It didn't work very well, so I ended up just grabbing my reverse tweezers and using those because they were just super tiny, and that made it a lot easier to hang on to. So once I finished that, I thought my card was done, and I was kind of racing against the sun that was creeping across my desk. But I just decided that that penguin looked a little too lonely and he needed a friend. And I also needed something to tie in that red sentiment. It just looked a little bit out of place against that purple. So I colored him a friend with a red hat, and I felt like that just pulled everything together. And that is going to complete my card for today. So there is another peek at the inside. If you agreed that the little penguin needed a friend, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button, and also make sure that you're subscribed and that you've rung that notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. I post new ones every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday right now. And if you're interested in any of the products that I used today, you will find those listed and linked below the video. If you'd like to watch day 2 of the previous 2 years of holiday card series, you can find those on screen right now. And thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have an amazing day. Bye-bye.